What would you do if you were finally home after 2 years abroad, ready to relax and unwind, only for the unexpected to happen? I thought it was just a quiet night in my childhood room, but when my little brother suddenly barged in, I was caught in a situation I never imagined. The shock was instant, the tension palpable, and I couldn't escape what I was feeling. Let me tell you what happened next, because I never expected to be in a situation like this with him. It wasn't just the shock of seeing Jason standing there, mouth agape, frozen in the doorway. It was the realization that, in that split second, everything had changed. He wasn't the awkward, gangly little brother I remembered. He was a man now. His broad shoulders, the new confidence in the way he stood, the way he looked at me. It all made my heart race in a way I couldn't explain. I'd been away for so long, and in those years, Jason had gone from the kid I used to babysit to someone who was different. It wasn't just physical, though. There was something in his eyes, a calmness, a knowing, that made him seem like a stranger in the best possible way. When we'd hugged earlier that evening, I couldn't help but notice how solid he felt under my touch. I kept trying to shake the thought, but it clung to me, like a whisper that I couldn't ignore. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I found myself lying in my old bed, the quiet of the house pressing in around me. I couldn't stop thinking about Jason, about how he'd looked at me, about the strange sensation of being so close to him again after all these years. It was confusing. I knew it was wrong to even think about him this way. He was my brother. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but feel a pull, a curiosity about the man he had become. I let my mind wander, just a little at first, brushing over the idea. What harm could it do to fantasize? After all, I hadn't had any real intimacy in ages. Between school and life, I'd been too busy to even think about it. This was just a way to relax. But the more I thought about it, the more vivid the images became. Jason's laugh, the way he stood, confident but easygoing. And suddenly there I was imagining his touch, feeling the heat that spread through me at the thought of him. I tried to ignore it, tried to push the thought away, but it wouldn't go. Instead, I gave in. My fingers moved on their own, gently caressing my skin, each touch igniting a spark. And there he was again, Jason in my mind, this time with his hands on me, his voice low as he whispered my name. It was wrong, so wrong, but it felt so real, like he was right there with me. The more I let myself think about it, the stronger the pull became. It wasn't just the physical attraction anymore. It was something deeper, more intense. The thought of Jason, of the way he had changed, the man he'd become, it all felt too complicated to ignore. But I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that weighed on me. This was my brother. I should have never been thinking about him this way, yet the images of him in my mind kept resurfacing, each one more vivid than the last. I tried to convince myself it was just a moment of weakness. Maybe it was the jet lag or the stress of being away for so long. But as I lay there in the quiet of my room, I could feel the heat building in my chest, spreading through me like a wildfire I couldn't control. It was irrational. It was wrong. But it felt so good. And then it happened. The door to my room slammed open without warning. I froze, my body tensing as the air seemed to crack with the tension between us. Jason was standing there, wide-eyed, his jaw dropped as he took in the sight of me. I was exposed in the most vulnerable way, mentally and emotionally. His shock mirrored mine, but it was quickly followed by something else, something I didn't expect. Instead of turning away, he just stood there, staring at me. His face turned bright red, his eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The silence between us was deafening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my voice broke through. "Jason, what the hell?" I shouted, my voice sharp, though it sounded more panicked than I intended. "I didn't know you. Never lock your door," he stammered, backing away and grabbing a pillow to cover himself, though I was fully clothed. My heart was racing, but it wasn't just fear. It was embarrassment, anger, and something else I couldn't quite name. Jason's face was still crimson, but as the tension shifted, I could see a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He was laughing. "You might want to hang a sign or something," he joked, backing out of the room with his hands up, as if surrendering. The laughter that followed felt out of place, like he hadn't just walked in on the most embarrassing moment of my life. I sat there, stunned, my mind racing as he closed the door behind him. I could hear him running down the stairs, still laughing, and I just sat there, my face burning, my heart pounding. But here's where it gets strange. Instead of feeling mortified or disgusted, I felt something else. A spark. The way his eyes had widened, the way his expression shifted. It had affected me in a way I didn't expect. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. There was something thrilling about it, something that I couldn't ignore. It was like a switch had been flipped, and all the tension that had been building was now too much to ignore. I spent the next few hours trying to get myself together, pacing around my room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was still racing, my body buzzing with energy I couldn't explain. Jason had laughed it off, acting like it was no big deal, but I couldn't stop replaying that moment in my head. His eyes, the way they seemed to catch me in that vulnerable state, and the way my body had reacted, even in the aftermath. I should have been mortified, but instead I felt something else. A spark. Something that wasn't just about what had happened, but something deeper. Something that terrified me. I tried to push it aside, tried to focus on anything else, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't escape the thoughts of him. Jason. The way he had looked at me. The way he had just stood there, frozen for that moment, but then it was like something shifted. He hadn't run away. He hadn't looked away. And I couldn't stop wondering if he'd been affected the same way I was. The next day, Jason acted like nothing had happened. He was the same as always, joking around at breakfast, casually scrolling through his phone. But I couldn't meet his eyes. Every time I looked at him, I was reminded of what had happened. The embarrassment was still there, sure, but it was mixed with something else. A desire that I wasn't sure how to handle. The day dragged on, each minute feeling like it stretched into eternity. I tried to avoid him, but it was hard in a house that small. My thoughts kept drifting back to him. To his laugh. To the way his hand had brushed against mine in the dark. To the heat that had flared between us, even after everything. When my parents left that evening, I didn't know what to expect. They were heading to my grandparents' house for the night, leaving me and Jason alone in the house. At first, I tried to keep it together, pretending like I wasn't feeling the overwhelming tension that filled the air. I stayed in my room, scrolling through my phone, pretending to be absorbed in whatever I was looking at, but my mind kept drifting back to him. Then, as the house grew quieter, as the hours passed, I couldn't take it anymore. The longing, the tension, it had built up inside me, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to see him. I had to do something. I slipped out of my room as quietly as I could and padded down the hall to his room. His door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the soft sound of his breathing. When I peeked inside, I saw him lying on his bed, fast asleep. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I hesitated. Was I really going to do this? Was I really going to cross that line? But before I could second-guess myself, I stepped inside, quietly closing the door behind me. His room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of his desk lamp. The air felt thick, almost electric, as I slowly climbed onto his bed, my body trembling with nerves but also a strange sense of urgency. I lay down next to him, mirroring his position, close enough that I could feel his warmth, hear the rhythm of his breathing. My heart raced in my chest, my mind spinning with the consequences of what I was about to do. But the pull was too strong. I had to know what it would feel like. I had to find out if this tension, this connection, was real. For a moment, everything felt surreal. There was a nervous energy between us, an undeniable charge that hung in the air like a secret neither of us was ready to fully acknowledge. Jason's breathing remained steady, his body so close to mine, yet I could feel the distance between us, emotional, mental, and physical. I wasn't sure if he was asleep or if he could sense my presence, but I didn't care. I had crossed the threshold, and now there was no going back. I moved closer slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. My hand brushed his, and I felt a shiver run through me as the warmth of his skin made the room feel even hotter. He stirred, a soft murmur escaping his lips, and I froze for a moment, wondering if I should stop. But I couldn't. The desire to know what it would feel like to be this close to him, to feel his touch, was too overwhelming. Without thinking, I reached for his hand, placing it on my waist, my breath catching as his fingers made contact with my skin. He didn't pull away. For a second, there was just a stillness, a quiet hesitation, and then his hand shifted, his fingers tentative at first, but growing more confident as he moved along my side. My body responded instinctively, a rush of heat spreading through me at the gentleness of his touch. I was drowning in the moment, in the softness of his touch, the warmth of his body, and the realization that this wasn't just some fantasy anymore. It was happening. It was real. And every inch of me screamed that I shouldn't be doing this, but I couldn't stop. I wanted it. I wanted him. Jason's hand moved slowly, cautiously, his fingers brushing against the curve of my waist. He hesitated again, unsure, but I gave him the slightest nod, urging him to keep going. The uncertainty in his touch faded, replaced by something else, something deeper, more determined. His hand moved across my back, his fingers tracing the edges of my shirt, and I could feel the heat rising between us, making it hard to breathe. I was lost in him. My mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them seemed to matter. There was only the warmth of his hand on me, the steady rhythm of his breath, and the undeniable pull between us that had only grown stronger since the moment he walked in last night. Then he looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise, as if he wasn't sure if this was real. "Tiffany," he whispered, his voice rough, the weight of the moment heavy in his tone. What are we doing?" I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the words that were stuck in my throat. What were we doing? Was this really happening? Was I really going to cross this line with my brother? But the pull between us was undeniable. I reached out, gently cupping his face, and pulled him closer. "I don't know," I whispered back, my voice trembling. "But I need you." As our lips met, everything else faded away. The guilt, the confusion, the consequences, all of it disappeared in that instant. It was just him and me in this moment together. This part deepens the emotional connection and the complexity of their interaction, moving them further into the intimate and forbidden territory. The protagonist's internal conflict intensifies as she gives in to her desires. Would you like to continue with the next part? The kiss was tentative at first, a gentle meeting of lips that quickly became something more. It wasn't just about the physical connection, it was about something deeper, something that I had been hiding, something that I couldn't control anymore. My heart was racing, but I couldn't pull away. His lips were warm and soft, and as the kiss deepened, I felt his body respond to mine, his hand sliding along my back, pulling me closer. Everything about the moment was overwhelming. The way he touched me, the way he kissed me, like he was both unsure and certain at the same time. It was as if we were both navigating a new territory, unsure of where we were going, but unable to stop. I could feel the hesitation in him, the confusion, but there was something else there too, desire. Raw, unspoken desire. His hands moved down my back, his fingers tracing the curve of my waist. I felt his breath on my skin as his lips moved to my neck, kissing me softly, his touch becoming more urgent. Each press of his lips sent a thrill through me, a spark of heat that spread through my entire body. The tension between us was palpable, building with every touch, every kiss. I could feel his heart pounding beneath his chest, his breath quickening as his hands slid lower, reaching the hem of my shirt. I froze for a moment, a wave of guilt and hesitation crashing over me. Was this really happening? Could I really do this? I glanced up at him, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't noticed before: fear. But it wasn't the kind of fear that made him pull away. It was the kind of fear that made him lean in closer, wanting more despite the uncertainty. "Tiffany," he whispered, his voice shaking, I don't know what this is. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain the feelings that had been building up inside me since the moment I walked into that room last night. All I knew was that I didn't want to stop. I didn't want this to end. Without thinking, I kissed him again, deeper this time, more desperate, as if to show him that it didn't matter. That whatever this was, it felt right in that moment. He responded, his hands pulling me closer, his lips pressing harder against mine, as if he too had given in to the gravity of the situation. The world outside the room seemed to disappear. The guilt, the hesitation, everything that had held us back before, it didn't matter anymore. There was only us here in this moment, lost in each other. But even as I kissed him, even as I let myself give in, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered, "What happens next?" The kiss felt like an explosion, a wave of warmth and desire that left me breathless. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything except the heat between us. Jason's hands were everywhere, his touch firm, his movements sure, as if he had finally stepped into a role he hadn't known he'd been playing. There was no more hesitation in him, just the pure, raw connection we shared, each kiss pulling us deeper into something we couldn't escape. His hands moved to the hem of my shirt again, this time not stopping. I should have said something, should have stopped him. I should have remembered who he was, my little brother, the boy I used to look after. But every thought that crossed my mind was drowned by the overwhelming desire to feel him, to let myself get lost in the moment. He paused for a second, looking at me with those dark eyes, full of something I couldn't quite name. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost fragile, like the weight of what was happening was just beginning to hit him. But it wasn't a question that needed an answer. His hands moved again, sliding under my shirt, and I felt the electricity between us spark with each touch. I nodded, my breath shallow. Yes, I whispered. I couldn't lie to him, couldn't pretend anymore. I needed him just as much as he needed me. The room felt suffocating as the space between us closed. I felt his chest against mine, the heat of his skin sending shivers through me. It was everything. Everything I'd been trying to deny, everything I'd been trying to fight against. And yet, in that moment, it felt impossible to pull back. Jason's lips moved to my neck, trailing kisses that made my body hum with need. His hands explored, moving with purpose now, confident in the way he touched me. But every touch sent a wave of guilt crashing over me. What were we doing? This wasn't right. But the voice of reason in my head was quiet, drowned out by the flood of sensations that rushed through me. For a moment, I just let it happen, let myself get lost in the warmth of his body, the sensation of his lips on mine, the way he moved against me. But deep down, I knew this couldn't last. We couldn't keep doing this. When we finally broke apart, both of us gasping for air, the silence in the room was deafening. We lay there, our bodies pressed together, but the space between us had grown even larger. It wasn't just physical anymore. The weight of what we'd just done hung in the air like a suffocating fog. I turned my head to look at him, and I saw the same confusion in his eyes that I felt in my chest. Jason, I started, but my voice caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? How could I explain this? But before I could say anything more, Jason gently pulled me back to him, his hand cupping my face. It's okay, he whispered. We don't need to talk about it. Not yet. The words were like a balm, soothing the fear that had been building inside me. But as his lips met mine again, I couldn't help but wonder. What would we do now? Was this just a moment, something we would eventually forget, or had we crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? This part explores the aftermath of their intimate encounter, where both characters are dealing with the complex emotions that come with what they've just done. The tension is still high, and the consequences of their actions start to settle in, but they continue to give in to the moment. Would you like to continue with the next part, or explore another direction? The night stretched on in silence, each minute dragging, and yet, it felt like everything was happening in fast forward. Jason's hand stayed on mine, his touch grounding me, but it wasn't enough to chase away the doubts that clouded my mind. The intensity of the moment had faded, but now there was only confusion, guilt, and an undeniable sense of something changing, something irreversible. As I lay there, still wrapped up in the warmth of his body, I couldn't stop thinking about the weight of our actions. What had we just done? What had I just done? This wasn't a fleeting moment of weakness. This was something real, something dangerous. I could feel the heaviness of it pressing against my chest, each breath harder than the last. My mind kept telling me it was wrong, but my body had betrayed me, responding to him in ways I couldn't ignore. Jason stirred beside me, his arm pulling me a little closer, and I felt the weight of his body against mine. His breath was slow, steady, and I wondered if he was feeling the same swirl of emotions inside him, or if he was somehow more at ease with what had just happened. But when I turned to look at him, his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with that same uncertainty I felt in my own chest. Jason, I whispered, barely able to speak. What now? What does this mean? He didn't answer immediately. His fingers brushed against my hair, pushing it back from my face, and for a moment, I could see the conflict in his eyes. His lips parted, but then he hesitated, as if he didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of what we had just crossed. I don't know, he said, his voice barely a murmur. I couldn't stop. I don't know if I even want to. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but they also stirred something else inside me, a spark of relief, perhaps? Was I the only one caught in the storm of conflicting emotions, or did Jason feel it too? I couldn't bring myself to ask him, couldn't bring myself to say what was on the tip of my tongue. What happens next? The silence stretched between us again, longer this time, thicker. Neither of us seemed ready to speak, but neither of us moved. We just lay there, caught between what had happened and the unknown future ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jason shifted slightly, his hand brushing against mine once more. We don't have to talk about it, he said softly, his voice rougher than before. At least not yet. I don't think I'm ready to figure this out. I nodded slowly, unsure if that was what I wanted, but at the same time it seemed like the only option. The weight of the situation felt like it was too much to bear, and I knew that the more we talked, the harder it would be to take it back. And yet, even as I agreed to pretend like nothing had happened, I couldn't ignore the feeling inside me, that strange spark that wouldn't go away. I wasn't sure what it meant, but the feeling of Jason next to me, his body so close, his presence undeniable, was more real than anything else in my life right now. As the night continued, neither of us spoke much, but we didn't need to. The tension, the confusion, the undeniable desire. It filled the room, leaving a space between us that was both suffocating and comforting at the same time. The days following that night felt like they stretched on forever. Jason and I moved around each other like we were walking on eggshells, both of us caught in this strange, unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to handle. I avoided eye contact whenever I could, my mind racing with guilt and confusion, trying to convince myself that it had been a mistake. But the memory of that night, the way his hands had felt on me, the heat of his body against mine, kept replaying in my head over and over again, each time more vivid than the last. Jason, on the other hand, acted like nothing had happened. He was his usual self, easygoing, cracking jokes, acting like the awkward little brother I used to know. But I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of something when our paths crossed, the hesitation in his gaze whenever he looked at me. It was clear that we were both trying to pretend like we hadn't crossed a line. But no matter how hard we tried, we both knew it had happened. And nothing would ever be the same again. That evening, after dinner, I found myself alone in the living room, my mind spinning with everything that had happened. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the television the only sound. Jason had gone to his room, and I was left in the silence, left to face the reality of what we'd done. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend like everything was fine, like this was just some momentary lapse in judgment. This was real. We had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. I stood up, pacing the room, my hands trembling. What was I supposed to do now? What was Jason thinking? Had he regretted it? Or was he pretending just like I was? Just then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, Jason, standing in the doorway, looking at me with a mix of uncertainty and something else I couldn't quite place. He stepped into the room slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "About you." The words sent a jolt through me. I wasn't sure if it was the shock or the rush of desire that surged through me, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. "I know it's wrong," he continued, his voice shaking slightly. "But I can't help it. I can't stop thinking about how it felt." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Was he really saying this? Was he really admitting what I was feeling too? "I can't stop thinking about it either," I whispered, my voice barely audible. It was the truth, and I hated myself for it. But it was out now, and there was no taking it back. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us was unbearable, thick and heavy, and yet there was this pull, this magnetic force that seemed to draw us closer, despite the consequences. Jason took a step closer to me, his hand reaching out to gently brush my cheek. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice so quiet that I almost didn't hear him. I didn't know. I didn't have an answer. But in that moment, as I looked into his eyes, I realized that I didn't want to walk away from him. I didn't want to push him away. The feelings, the desire, it was too much to ignore. But where did we go from here? Jason's hand hovered near my face for a second longer, his touch gentle but filled with 1,000 unspoken questions. I wanted to pull away, to push him back, but there was something about the way he looked at me, something that made me freeze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt suffocating, the silence between us louder than any words could be. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to explain the way I felt, the turmoil inside me. Every part of me screamed that we couldn't keep doing this, that what we'd done was a mistake, something that would ruin everything. But another part of me, the part one couldn't deny, wanted him more than anything. Jason's breath caught, and for a moment we just stood there inches apart, neither of us moving. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached for me, pulling me closer. His lips found mine again, and this time there was no hesitation. There was nothing but the raw, unfiltered connection that neither of us could escape. I kissed him back, deeply, desperately, as if the act itself would erase everything that was wrong. But in the back of my mind, I knew this couldn't last. The consequences would come. They always did. But for now, all I could do was feel him, feel the heat of his touch, the intensity of his kiss, and the way his body pressed against mine. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our hearts racing in unison. I didn't know what to say. What was there left to say? We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And now, there was only the weight of what had happened hanging over us, threatening to change everything. Jason took a step back, his hand still resting lightly on my waist. "What do we do now?" he whispered again, his voice hoarse, filled with uncertainty. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what came next. But I did know one thing. I couldn't go back to pretending it hadn't happened. I couldn't go back to the way things were. Not now. Not after everything that had unfolded between us. "I don't know," I replied softly, my voice trembling with the weight of everything unsaid. "I don't know what we do now." We stood there in the silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. The consequences of our actions would catch up to us eventually. But for now, there was only the undeniable truth between us. The truth that we had crossed a line, and neither of us knew how to move forward. But somehow we both knew that whatever came next, we couldn't ignore the bond that had formed between us. And so, as the night stretched on and the house remained eerily quiet, I realized that there was no going back from what had happened. What we had done couldn't be undone. The only thing left to figure out was whether we could live with the consequences, or if we were already too deep to escape. This part wraps up the emotional turmoil, leaving the characters in the midst of their uncertainty and the unspoken bond that has formed. They've crossed an irreversible line, and now they're faced with the consequences of their actions. The story ends with an open-ended question about what happens next. Would you like to explore anything further or need help with any other aspects of the story?